Greetings, historians. Welcome to your Period 7 review. If you were unable to attend our previous Zoom sessions, worry not. Stress-free environment. We're going to be covering the exact same material that we covered in those Zoom sessions today for this recorded opportunity. So without further ado, we have got a lot to get to. Period 7 is a beast. There is so much material to get through. So I encourage you to have a pen ready to write with and something to write on as we unpack the years of 1890 to 1945. Let's go ahead and begin, and I'll bring up my slideshow here so you have a visual. Period 7, being as large as it is, I can almost guarantee is going to have some sort of coverage on this upcoming AP exam. How couldn't you? Look at what you're covering in this time period. The Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression and the New Deal, both of the world wars, imperialism and progressivism. If there is an Asian or an ism, more than likely it's going to be found in period 7. Now, there are a couple of things that you do need to do for me in preparation for understanding period 7 a little bit more. And so I encourage you, in fact, I strongly encourage you to make sure you can get onto your AP Classroom account. If you have a problem with your login or your passwords, simply use the forgot password feature on that, and College Board will work with you directly, ensuring that you have access to that particular portal. And once you get into AP Classroom, I'd like you to complete the Unit 7 progress check. It's only 39 multiple choice questions. It is not an exercise on whether or not you get the questions right or wrong and then get assigned a grade. So I don't encourage you during this to treat it like you would an examination, but more of just a review with some questions. So answer it. If you get it wrong, hey, no biggie. Once you click, it will reveal the correct answer and gives you an understanding of where your weak spots might be. So I'd like you to get that completed if you can in the days ahead. 39 multiple choice questions, pretty straightforward. And then on Canvas, I'd like you to complete the only SAQ we have for period 7, and you'll find that on your Canvas account already assigned. And both of these will be due, and I put them in quotation marks, due on Sunday at 11:59. That due is very soft. Again, I do not know how these will be extracted into the grade book. We haven't been given direction on grading just yet for the sixth 6 weeks. But once you have these items complete, I will have a treasure trove, a portfolio of products from once you have produced, and then I can apply the appropriate grades throughout the grade book. Sunday at 11:59. If you can't make that deadline, no stress, no worry. Just let me know, message me on Reminder, send me an email, and I'll be able to manipulate that due date to meet your schedule. Because, as I said before, I know the tremendous demands that are being placed on you with this new normal, life in quarantine. In fact, I was joking on the Zoom meetings with students saying that I'm going to start measuring history in BC before COVID-19 or before Corona. All right, let's look at the big picture of period 7 and step back for just a second and see some of the literature that comes to us from the College Board. And they're asking, in essence, an increasingly pluralistic United States faced profound domestic and global challenges. Let's not read on. Let's just start there. An increasingly pluralistic United States facing profound domestic and global challenges. Taking just a few moments, think about some of the domestic challenges that the United States is facing in this new, modern 20th century America. We have rapidly expanding populations in rather large urban centers, both with a great migration of African Americans from the South moving to the North. Immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, these new immigrants, these new Europeans coming into the urban centers of the East Coast. We have vast internal migration of people leaving the disenfranchised breadbasket, the Great Plains of the United States, the farmers, if you will, coming on the heels of a somewhat successful but then rapidly diminishing populism movement. And so the United States is becoming more pluralistic in the sense of demography. It's becoming more pluralistic in the sense of economic strata. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. A large amount of wealth is being amassed with a very small percentage of the population. And this is going to create those domestic challenges, such as a Red Scare, nativism, and racism, gender equality, and women's rights. And that inward look is going to push the United States to look outwardly, facing many global challenges, such as imperialism. Should we expand as a nation of self-sovereignty and self-determination? Should we, in essence, plant our American flag in foreign nations? And that is going to create a debate on the proper degree of use of government and activism and kind of seeking our role in this big picture. So all of what we have put together in this rather large isolationism period of period 3 and 4, 5, and 6 is really going to now thrust us in period 7 into a very global role that the United States, in its infancy, it's still an infant nation compared to your Europeans, is going to now seek to define its international role. So let's break down period 7 in an inward and outward looking kind of paradigm. Inwardly, the United States is going to be looking at reforming its ills of society through the progressive era. And then the shift of America's gaze turns outward. And we're going to now see what life will be like through American imperialism, expanding Empire America. And of course, its first involvement in a rather large conflict called the Great War. We don't call it World War I just yet. In fact, that would be a huge concern for individuals if they were getting ready to go off to fight World War I. They'd probably turn around and say, well, why are you calling it World War I? Is there a two that I don't know about? So contextually, we'll be referring to it as the Great War before we get to the Second World War. And then we turn back again to an inward look at the United States, the roaring 20s, that laissez-faire economics, the return to normalcy that's being used by the Harding administration in trying to bring American values back into the continental 48 states, which is going to then proceed into a Great Depression and a rather large injection of government involvement in everyday life through the New Deal. And then we turn outwardly again towards the interwar years and the Second World War. So part 1 is an inward look at America. Part 2 is an outward global look. Part 3 is an inward domestic look at America. And part 4 is an outward look. Now let's break that down into some more specific pieces of evidence. In modern America, at the beginning of the 20th century, what is it that we're producing? Well, for starters, we're producing consumer goods. These consumer goods are going to improve the standard of living. In fact, there is a huge contextual and causation with women finding their life in a still rather domesticated life, having more time on their hands instead of in the Victorian age or of period 6 in the Gilded Age, taking an entire area rug, taking all the furniture off the rug, dragging that rug out into the street, beating that rug with a stick until it airs out, dragging that rug back in and replacing the furniture. Just simply cleaning the floor could be an entire day event. Well, by producing a vacuum cleaner, that could take all of 10 minutes to clean the living room, leaving the largely domesticated woman in the context of the turn of the century with much more time on our hands to get involved in politics and to get involved in the rather global workforce that is emerging in the United States. It is going to provide us with greater mobility. We're going to see trains not necessarily increasing in size, but becoming more efficient and faster. The automobile is going to make its way onto the scene, really connecting America and dissipating some of that social sectionalism that we saw. There's still going to be a very strong sentiment of what it means to be a New Englander or a New Yorker or a Southerner. But the overarching unification of America is going to be much more smaller with the automobile, allowing us to travel to places at breakneck speed, at least in the context of the early 20th century. And then we're going to see the airplane, while largely a piece of technology that is going to be used in World War I and World War II as military hardware. Americans are going to begin boarding aircraft in the 1930s for passenger reasons, and that's going to really expand in the 1950s and 60s with the jet age and the jet setters of Pan Am crossing the Atlantic to Europe. Better communications are going to be a big component of period 7 as well. We were simply using the telegraph all through the Civil War and through period 6, but better communications with the telephone are going to allow us to really unify the nation in such a way that we have never seen before. If we were to use continuity and change over time, that communication is going to move through radio in the 1920s and 30s, through television in the 1950s, and all the way to period 9 with cell phones and the internet. Modern day conveniences that we have to communicate is really going to allow us to expand our knowledge base, to shape our political ideologies, and really improve the economy. In fact, most of the West Coast's economy, at one time being industrial in World War II, really shifted to a technological center with Silicon Valley. So even America's economic footprint is shaped by just telecommunications. Look at Apple, for instance, even in the modern age. Where are we living in this time period? Well, we're in urban centers. You have to look at it from this perspective. In 1790, 80% of the country was living in that Jeffersonian rural loose confederacy of farms, that perfect utopic Jeffersonian country. Very little urban gathering. At that point, we really had New York and Boston on the map. But by 1890, we're going to almost flip that data around. And I'm keeping that data very loose. There's some tighter numbers that would purport a variation of that by 2 or 3%. But by and large, 80% of the country is going to be urban by 1890, and only 20% is going to be rural. And that number is only going to increase in an urban environment until after World War II, when we have the baby boom and we are no longer going to reside in a specifically rural area or an urban area, but now in a suburban area with the growth of Levitt towns and the neighborhoods much like you and I live in today. We're going to be having new economic opportunities in the city, and that's going to provide people to have quick access to their work. No longer are they going to have to commute for miles and miles and miles from the farm to into town, for instance, and work in their little cobbler store making shoes. The cottage industry is going to go away and be replaced with large conglomerates, large merged corporations. And so these new economic opportunities are going to give people the opportunity to have a lot of jobs, both for men, women, and for African Americans. But there's going to be some negative components to an increased economic opportunity in the city, and that's going to provide us with increased corruption and increased nativism. The push to limit the amount of immigrants coming into the country is going to be seen extensively through immigration quota acts like the Immigration Act of 1924, limiting the number of foreigners that can come in and take the jobs from Americans that are working in those industrial centers. So I'd like to just take a second to think about the Gilded Age and apply what we learned in period 6 with the Gilded Age to period 7. And it follows this very specific formula that we're going to get businesses that are going to expand, big business. We talk extensively about the most. We've got money with J.P. Morgan, oil with John Rockefeller, steel with Andrew Carnegie, and trains with Cornelius Vanderbilt. M-O-S-T. The country was the most. And those big businesses are going to beget big cities. Once those big cities grow, then it's going to beget big corruption with Boss Tweed and the folks at Tammany Hall and the political machines. And we'll talk about that extensively here in just a second. And all of the rapid growth of big businesses and big cities and big corruption is going to come down to big changes. Now, who are going to make those changes? What group is going to come along and seek to make that change implemented? And it's going to be the progressives. They want to progress society. And a lot of the monumental changes that they're going to be fighting for are going to be those political corruptions and those machines. Remember, Boss Tweed and the guys of Tammany Hall appealed predominantly to an urban immigrant population by promising them an increased quality of life. Hey, I'll pay for your electricity, or I'll keep the lights on, or I'll clean out the garbage dumpsters in your alleyway, or I will help feed your children or get your children to a school if you simply elect individuals that I want to into local politics. So Boss Tweed and these other guys upon whom Thomas Nast, the famous cartoonist, would lampoon, would show him being an individual that would stand there in the middle of the street with his potbelly handing out vouchers to individuals. And all he wanted in return was for you to vote for a particular politician, particularly at the local level, that he saw fit to continue helping him become richer. So the people loved him. They really loved what Boss Tweed was doing. And so they weren't going to push back because they were in on the take as well. The social injustice that we saw proclamated during this time period is going to be really evidenced with the muckrakers. The muckrakers like Upton Sinclair going to Chicago to simply talk about the Eastern European immigrants working there, more of a labor story, found that the meatpacking industry was grotesque. And he aimed for their hearts and ended up affecting their stomachs. And Upton Sinclair's Jungle was a bestseller, exposing and then encouraging the expansion of the Food and Drug Act to provide safety for what you're in essence eating. We've got Ida Tarbell and the history of Standard Oil and Lincoln Steffens and the shame of the cities, talking about these tenement houses. So muckrakers had the opportunity and the know-how and the ability and the access to be able to publish articles in newspapers and trade journals and magazines and books to really bring to light the injustices that are being faced in the urban centers. They also addressed economic inequality. The progressives really wanted to see less divisiveness between the top 1% of 1% amassing a huge percentage of wealth and leaving the vast majority of the population below that line, kind of shouldering the burden of the labor and the life, but not enjoying some of the benefits of that capital that is really being amassed by the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. So the progressives are going to push, particularly the gentleman that you see on the screen here, President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, TR, is going to be pushing for breaking up these trusts. We had initially the Sherman Antitrust Act in period 6 that was effective, lowercase quotation marks, but it's going to be the Clayton Antitrust Act that's going to come in behind it, that's really going to shore up the government's involvement in this time period. If you recall in period 6, and if I were to ask you right now, give me the names of the presidents after Rutherford B. Hayes. Well, I even teach APUSH and find it difficult to go through, well, was it Chester Arthur? No, it was James Garfield. No, it was Grover Cleveland. And right? That kind of milky oatmeal period of presidents is difficult because they were so ineffective in American history that it's much easier for us to recall Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan than it is to recall those presidents. So really, we kind of have this from Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt comes on the scene because of the impact he had in pushing back at that very laissez-faire economy that was underway after the Civil War. They're also going to be looking to improve the environment. The progressives are going to seek environmental preservation. The rapid industrialization was really harming the cities. The cholera rates were increasing significantly. Look at the Spanish flu in 1918, in the throes of the First World War. So there are many environmentalists that come forward, particularly John Muir of the Sierra Club, good friends with Teddy Roosevelt, are going to partner in trying to preserve what is America. Yellowstone National Park, perhaps you might have traveled there, or other national parks west of the Rocky Mountains, Rocky Mountain National Park, Bryce, Zion, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite. These staples of the American road trip are really going to come to light in the midst of the progressive age in an attempt to preserve the environmental landscape of the United States. Who are these progressives? Were they middle and upper class, journalists, educated, they're authors, having the ability to use the resources at their fingertips to, in essence, bring about change. Many were women, including Jane Addams and the settlement houses. These houses provided respite for women that have been displaced either by the family situation or abandonment. And so these settlement houses were wildly successful in the midst of the progressive age. And what is the federal legislation going to look like? Well, they're going to look to regulate the economy, as I said earlier, with that trust busting, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and later the Clayton Antitrust Act. They're going to expand democracy through women's suffrage. We're going to see the birth of the 19th Amendment. In fact, 2020 is the centennial of the woman. They're going to be able to go to the polls now and cast their ballots. La Follette in Wisconsin is going to push for a more local control of the people having more access to democracy through recall. meaning if you don't like that individual that you have elected into office, there is a process in place in which you can recall them from their position. There are referendums that are being put into place. Instead of the government just deeming what is a new policy, they might put that policy before the American people and say, what do you think about this policy? And allow the American people to say yes or no, thumbs up or thumbs down, to enact that change. And the Australian secret ballot is going to make its way into the vernacular. And instead of back in the old days, you would walk in and cast your vote. I cast my vote for Billy Bob Johnson. And they tally their vote this way, almost kind of like the Iowa caucus does even to this very day. The secret ballot is going to be a way in which you can go today that's still used into a booth or at least an enclosed environment and cast your ballot secretly. So you don't feel like you are beholden to somebody. And imagine Boss Tweed standing at the door with his cigar, leaning against the wall, nodding and watching you closely to see if you cast your ballot for the person he wants to be placed into office. Women are really going to come onto the scene. We did hear from the Women Christian Temperance Union throughout periods 5 and 6, but we're going to see a real push towards this generation of moral reform through the temperance movement that is going to get an amendment to the Constitution, the 18th Amendment of the Constitution, because temperance was so important to these women for a myriad of reasons. The American family was being destroyed by increased drinking. There was domestic violence. There was children being born out of wedlock. Gentlemen were spending their money at the pubs instead of bringing it home to support the family. And a large portion of the drinking population at the turn of the century were immigrants. A lot of Italians and Irish were drinking. So temperance was a twofold movement by these women to really control men who were using alcohol as an escape as opposed to putting money in towards their family, to provide a safe environment for their family with either domestic violence or to limit the scope at which immigrants would be drinking. So there was a myriad of moral implications for really pushing for this type of temperance. And the splintering with the progressives, well, the progressives really didn't address immigration policy. They did work with immigrants already in the country, in the tenement houses in the urban centers, but didn't really address any of the immigrant quota laws of immigrants coming into the country, nor did progressives really address segregation in the South. They turned a cold shoulder, if you will, to the plight of African Americans, both in a Jim Crow segregated South and in the industrial North. The progressive spectrum you hear does lean centrist politically. Again, we've looked at our progressive spectrum and our political spectrum throughout the course, saying that conservatism, pointing to the right, is basically stability, keeping things as they are, tradition. Liberalism, in the sense of this time period, means change. And so progressives are going to have a centrist approach to this, but they are going to lean a little bit more to the political left. Teddy Roosevelt, being the great politician of the time, really positioned himself very centrist on this issue, as did Woodrow Wilson during the First World War. Taft, the successor to Teddy Roosevelt, is going to lean a little bit more on the outskirts of that progressivism. Remember when Teddy Roosevelt left office and kind of deemed Taft to be his heir apparent, Taft went back to the old ways of crony capitalism and corruption, and Teddy Roosevelt disagreed vehemently with Taft on this issue, so much so that he broke away from the Republican Party and started that third party, Bull Moose Party, in the election of 1912. And then way, way, way out on the left side of this political spectrum, we're going to see the injection of socialism, the America's flirting with socialism, with Eugene Debs really pushing to bring about radical change, almost Marxist change, if you will. So you can see progressivism was a big table, and a lot of people sat at that table leaning a little bit more to the left, but remaining centrist. So it was cool and hip to be a progressive during this time period. And now, as we've looked inward, we're going to look outward. When the United States was founded on a belief in self-determination and sovereignty of nations, why did the country begin to embrace this imperialistic foreign policy? How can we as a nation that stood on the hill of Bunker Hill in Boston at one time telling King George that we will not listen to his tyranny, that we are an independent free nation, go into other nations, plant the American flag, and say that you are now ours. Well, the imperialists are going to have some very specific ideas for that. In fact, number one, they're going to say there's numerous economic opportunities, lots of natural resources in this area, and we have got to procure those areas for the economic security of the United States. There's a strategic initiative here. Alfred T. Mahan, in his treatise about a real country, a powerful country, will have control of the oceans. They'll have control of the seas. And so if you can control trade across the continent or across the oceans, if you will, and control the traffic of the oceans, then you will have a secure nation. So by placing military bases and ports, economic ports throughout the globe and maintaining those sea lanes for your country, you will be able to secure your economic footprint as well as your strategic footprint. There are racial theories abounding. Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden is going to purport that it is America's job to go to these heathens, if you will, in the South Pacific, in the Western Pacific, the Caribbean, and Latin America, to bring civilization to them, that they crave this, and that it is our responsibility to civilize these nations. There's going to be competition with Europe. You have to remember, contextually, Europe, at the heels of the Berlin Conference with Otto von Bismarck and the scramble for Africa, is going to leave America out of that footprint. Europe is carving up Africa. Europe is carving up the Middle East. Europe is carving up South Asia and India. There is now some proxy wars through opium being fought in China. Australia, of course, being a penal colony of the British Empire. As they say, the sun never set on the British Empire. The United States was in strict competition with Europe, in fact, proposing this kind of open door policy with China. Remember, the destination is China. That's where people want to go. That's kind of the last best hope for all of these emerging empires. And so the United States is going to propose kind of an open door policy. Hey, we're all here. Let's split the wealth equally. Let's share, and let's not fight over this. Of course, they're leaving China out of that discussion. And the perception that the frontier was closed. Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis in The Closing of the Frontier is going to say, well, once we reached California, once we reached Oregon and the West Coast, America is closed. Well, if you've traveled anywhere west of the Rocky Mountains in the salt flats of Bonneville and Utah, you'll see there's still plenty of frontier to be had in the United States. So the idea that the United States was already occupied and discovered, if you will, and now we have to continue that manifest destiny beyond the shores of California is going to be a big justification for those imperialists. Now, the anti-imperialists are going to simply cite that if you're going to exercise the principles of self-determination, you're basically a hypocrite if you're going to take over a country. The insular cases looked at the Constitution of the United States following American imperialists around the globe. So if you plant a flag in the soil of Guam or Puerto Rico or the Philippines, will the Constitution follow? And the insular cases, regrettably, and oddly enough, are going to say no. So the anti-imperialists are saying we are not expanding American ideals through the insular cases if we're not even expanding the Constitution to those countries. They're going to say that U.S. tradition with isolationism has been a big part of the American fabric for the better part of 100 years, from roughly 1800 to 1860. If you will. The United States did a great job through Henry Clay's American system and Alexander Hamilton's economic footprint, the era of good feelings, did quite well in expanding the nation economically. Now, we had the little kerfuffle in the Civil War, but shortly thereafter in 1877, up until the turn of the century, well, look at the expansion and the industrialization that took place then. So these anti-imperialists are going to say, we are doing fine by ourselves. We have for 100 years. We do not need to expand to these parts of the globe. And then that Spanish-American War is going to come onto the fabric of American society with the rapid expansion of new U.S. territories. In fact, a good, easy comparison between the Mexican-American War and the Spanish-American War are pretty simple. It was the expansion of this new territory for the purposes of keeping the American economy strong in the Caribbean, the Central and South Pacific, and the Philippines. We're going to see that rubber is going to be one of the largest exports out of these areas. Sugar in the Caribbean, rubber in the Central and the South Pacific. And so these natural resources are going to be vital to the continued economic growth of the United States. And Spanish-American War is going to challenge America's notion of Americanization through domestic issues like the dissing of America's reputation. I didn't have a better word for you than dissing, but that DeLome letter criticizing the McKinley administration and their ineptness is going to allow the United States to push its shoulders back and to puff its chest up and say, we will not be disrespected like that. And that is only going to be fanned by the flames coming off the printing press of the yellow journalist, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, kind of sensationalizing events like the sinking of the Maine. It was Spain that sunk the Maine, giving us a justification for going to war. Empire America expanding in the Pacific. This map here really almost looks like the map that we will look at in World War II with the various campaigns in the Pacific, complete with your Midway Island in American Samoa, Guam in the Philippines, Wake Island. These are all key battles during the Second World War, but territorial acquisition of the American empire vis-a-vis 1900. And so Japan, really wanting to secure their own footprint in the region, is going to seek to reclaim those, pushing their efforts eastward in the late 1930s and, of course, on December 7th, 1941. So this map will come back to us twofold here in the next 40 years. There are various forms of diplomacy that are going to emerge out of this age of imperialism. For instance, Teddy Roosevelt's going to utilize big stick diplomacy. He's going to say, you speak softly and carry a big stick, taking the Great White Fleet on tour throughout the South Pacific, throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Gulf of Mexico, showing the world that we are here, we have the weapons, don't make us use them. A bit softer approach from a different perspective is going to be Taft's dollar diplomacy, using the dollar as an investment tool, as assistance in Latin America, as a negotiating tool, citing dollars over bullets. If you were to invest in a country, help prop them up, perhaps even put them in debt, they will be at your beck and call. And we've seen this time and time again with sharecropping, putting newly freed African Americans in debt to their now former masters. We see it with the indentured servitude system in early British colonial American history, where if you come to America and work off your debt, that perpetual indebtedness will put people at a disposition and at their beck and call. So Taft is going to use the dollar as a leash, if you will, to keep these nations very close by. And Wilson is going to change it up just a little bit with his moral diplomacy, giving the United States an opportunity to show a moral example to the rest of the world, making, in his words, the world safer democracy. I think this echoes quite specifically John Winthrop and his push to make the Puritan colonies in Massachusetts what he said, a city upon a hill. Ronald Reagan is going to echo that many years later in the 1980s. If we are a moral example, the rest of the world will want to be like the United States. But the rest of the world didn't have time to look at the United States and what they were doing as a moral example. It was a war breaking out of on monumental proportions on the European continent that began what was called the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Now, without going into a world history lecture about the militarism and the alliances and the industrialization and the nationalism that occurred for causes of the Great War, followed by the powder keg moment of the Gavripo Principe firing upon the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife at the parade in Sarajevo, we do need to look at how the United States was strained in determining whether or not we should go to war. Remember, we are an isolationist nation looking inward, with the exception of the imperialism in the Pacific, and we don't really have time to deal with this kind of internal conflict that is occurring within the European continent. So the initial reaction to that outbreak in 1914 for the better part of a year and a half was just neutrality. We're going to turn a blind eye to the issue. We're going to continue to trade with Germany. We're going to continue to have a strong economic tie with Great Britain and France. So the United States, by taking a side at this point, would prove to be economically disadvantageous. So we're going to stay out of the issue. Wilson, keeping us out of war, is going to campaign on this in his second term, actually. But there are certain events that are going to begin to strain that U.S. neutrality, that are going to really put Woodrow Wilson in a difficult position, and his temper is going to increasingly become inflamed, pushing us towards war, specifically with the Zimmermann Note. Germans are going to send a telegram to Mexico encouraging them to take Germany's side, perhaps stage an invasion across the Rio Grande or through America's Southwest. And in exchange, Germany will help Mexico reclaim territory lost during the Mexican-American War. If I were president, this would probably be enough for me because it's literally in our backyard to go to war. But once again, the Zimmermann telegram simply strained relations with Woodrow Wilson and wasn't really placed into a category of an immediate cause of U.S. involvement in the war. The sinking of the Lusitania, largely a passenger ship, later on to be found carrying weapons across the Atlantic, is going to put Great Britain and the United States at a diplomatic disadvantage with each other. Woodrow Wilson, not knowing that that ship at the time was carrying weapons, only thought it was a passenger ship being sunk, but later to find out that it was a ship that was carrying those weapons, is going to call upon Great Britain to cease and desist any continued movement of those weapons, because the United States, again, does not want to get involved in this conflict. But in April of 1917, Woodrow Wilson stands before Congress asking them to declare war against the Austro-Hungarian and German empires because of unrestricted submarine warfare. You could mess with us through the Zimmermann telegram. You could even mess with us with a few passenger ships crossing the Atlantic, but do not, under any circumstances, mess with American trade and the American economy. So it is Germany's declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare of any ship crossing the Atlantic that's finally going to get Wilson to say enough is enough. In fact, I want to draw a sharp comparison for just a second between the vacillation of Wilson and his indecision to go to war or not, and really compare that. A good opportunity for you to have some compare and contrasting with FDR's rather quick decision to go to war shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the day after, literally, on December 7th, 1941. Now, FDR did have some programs in place that did help the British Empire underneath with Lend-Lease and cash and carry, but by and large, it was that dropping of the armament on Pearl Harbor that morning, on Sunday morning, that got FDR to say, let's go to war. Wilson didn't have that kind of sharp, specific moment. So the Doughboys reached the front lines in the spring of 1918. It is a war of attrition. Troop movement is going to be finding themselves very brutal in trenches. Disease is rampant in that area. It is a different type of warfare with chemical warfare, disfiguring armament that's going to be really horrific. And the United States and their efforts to bring not only weapons of offense to the region, but weapons of defense, gas masks, and other things like 2-pan chloride and atropine to react to nerve agents that soldiers would come into contact with, are going to help the Europeans and now the United States push forward and defeat the Germans. And Armistice Day is going to be developed in November of 1918, still today celebrated in the United States as Veterans Day. So what is happening on the war front at home? Now, this slideshow could probably be copied and pasted into the Second World War slideshow, because there's a lot that's being done to support the war on the home front. You can volunteer for service if you weren't later drafted. If you weren't able to volunteer, if you weren't physically able, or you were a male that was healthy enough to serve, you could do your part at home by rationing your oil. You could ration your fat from the food for lubrication of weaponry. You could grow a victory garden. So there are many things you could do, as you even see here, every garden a munition plant. You could purchase war bonds by taking money out of circulation. It's going to keep the value of currency high and limit inflation during a wartime effort. And by purchasing a war bond and taking money out of circulation, it helps support the war effort for the military to pay for that, and then they could pay it back later on and do so in the Roaring Twenties, greatly expanding people's individual wealth and showing American patriotism during this time by not speaking out against the war, stifling that free speech. We see the implementation shortly thereafter of the war of the Espionage and Sedition Act. Boy, what a great opportunity to compare and contrast, or show some continuity and change between that and John Adams's Alien and Sedition Act during the early years of the Republic. In Schenck versus the United States, that Supreme Court decision said that the ability for the country to stifle free speech is constitutional in a wartime footing. And that is going to be carried on in the years to follow through the Second World War and even into the Vietnam War, when America really speaks out against the United States. Because I don't want to paint a generalist picture that everybody in the country was for World War I and everybody in the country was for the Second World War. There were numerous dissenting voices throughout the country for both of these conflicts. Then there were a passage of immigration quotas like the Immigration Act of 1924, limiting those Eastern Europeans, particularly Germans and Austrians. I mean, think about it. We're just in a global war now with the Germans and the Austrians. And now they're going to, at least individuals are going to come and immigrate into the country along with Italy. So there's going to be significant immigration acts that are going to limit the amount of immigrants coming into the country. And in the midst of this great war at home, there's going to be rapid industrialization, the great migration of African Americans from a Jim Crow South where there's not much opportunity, still living in a life of sharecropping. Remember, we're only about 3 decades from the age of Reconstruction and the Civil War. Women are going to enter the workforce in rapid numbers, not quite to the numbers we see in the Second World War, but certainly are going to be large enough to be noticeable by historians. But life is going to change for Americans after they get back. The doughboys return from the battlefronts in Europe, and we're going to see labor conflicts and strike because now there's an oversaturation of the labor market. All these boys are returning home from war. Well, the factory jobs have still been going. African Americans are filling those jobs. Women are going to be filling those jobs. So a lot of the conflicts that we're going to see, the racial tensions that are going to rise, are not going to be limited to the Deep South. The South isn't the only part of the country that's going to see a rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Industrial centers like Detroit and Cleveland and New York City, areas that, at least in today's context or as historians think, are safe havens for the free African American post-Civil War, is not going to be so much that in the sense that they're going to be fighting for jobs in that area. And then we're going to see a push towards really looking for, hunting, seeking out communists in our country. Remember, the Bolshevik revolutions taking place during this time period. And so the ideas of Eugene Debs and socialism and this undercurrent of an increase in labor unions and pushing back the bourgeoisie and the proletariat rising up really is going to give the United States its first Red Scare. We're going to see that really grown into the second Red Scare under Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin in the 1950s. But by and large, after the war, the United States is war weary. They've had a wartime economy, and it's time to return to laissez-faire economics. Let's take care of America first and turn our sights inward. So again, the progressive era at the beginning of this was inward, then globalism and imperialism and World War I turned us outward. And now it's time to return back inward in this time period of the Roaring Twenties. But before we get to the Roaring Twenties, we need to clean up a few things on the international front, and that is Woodrow Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, Germans had to accept a war guilt, reparations, returning of their conquered land, and really limiting the size of their military. This was, in essence, some of the earliest causes of World War II. By putting Germany in this position, it's going to create a vacuum of leadership. It's going to create an economic footprint that is so devastating that a young Austrian is going to stand on a table at a beer hall in Munich and say, we will return the Third Reich or the Third Reich, and that's going to be Adolf Hitler. So the Treaty of Versailles is going to be categorized as one of the earliest causes of World War II, the failures of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Wilson did have some leadership in this. Wilson was beloved by France and by Great Britain. They considered him one of their sons, and his popularity was so incredible that the Republicans in Congress were concerned about this popularity. They were concerned that Woodrow Wilson would continue his reign, if you will, his kingship, if you will, because at this time we had no term limits on presidents. So Wilson's popularity could have returned him to a third term or even a fourth term, but it would be health that would be Wilson's biggest problem, preventing him from continuing a life in the presidency. But backing up from his subsequent stroke and death, Wilson did not take any congressional Republicans with him to the Paris trip. So that was already strike number one. And this popularity with Republicans, particularly Henry Cabot Lodge, wasn't comfortable with agreeing to anything that Wilson agreed with. Was it petty or was it political? Perhaps. Or were there some legitimate reasons why the Republicans in Congress did not want to enter into the League of Nations? Remember, the League of Nations was this proposed gathering of nations to prevent that war from future wars. it's going to be the predecessor to the United Nations. Well, the United States is not going to ratify the League of Nations. Historians will debate on the lack of being able to ratify it because Wilson had passed away. Remember, prior to Wilson's illness and his death, he did a coast-to-coast train trip getting Americans behind the idea of this League of Nations. And many will say it was the exhaustiveness of that trip that really got Wilson sick and killed him, or not killed him, but that he passed away because of that fervency of joining the League of Nations. But the Republicans in Congress and those that are going to push back against the League of Nations are going to say it's a strong sense of Americanism. We are Americans, and we're not going to listen to what Liechtenstein has to say. We're not going to agree to what Belgium has or bail them out. We're the United States, and marriage is easy, but the divorce is hard. If we decided to get out of the League of Nations, how would we? So there's going to be a push by Republicans, not only in Congress, but by Republicans running for president, particularly with Warren G. Harding and later on Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, to return the country to this domestic progressive agenda of laissez-faire economics. And that's going to be borne out in the Gilded Age of 2.0. And there were many social and political and economic conditions which kind of masked the underlying issues of the Roaring Twenties. We like to look at the Roaring Twenties on the surface and in reality. And so this decade that roared is going to see prohibition, the 18th and the 21st Amendments, the birth of the flapper and jazz. Remember, the woman now in the industrial sector is going to find a newfound freedom, both politically and socially. And so you could see the dress of these women is far different than the Victorian woman just 20 years earlier. The birth of the jazz is also going to shape the socio-cultural context of the United States through the Harlem Renaissance in Manhattan. We're going to see monumental impact of the car and radio, and any basic social studies class you could unpack on your own the importance of having a radio and a car now being injected into the American lexicon. There's going to be a new kind of found Art Deco that's going to reflect the ideals of the Roaring Twenties. If you look at the architecture of Art Deco, it is slick, it is metallic, it is linear, it rises to the sky. And so this new, fresh kind of Roaring Twenties perspective is going to come onto the forefront. And Art Deco is really going to kind of example that. If you're to travel to New York City, you'll see some of the Art Deco architectures, specifically in the Empire State Building and in the Chrysler Building and Rockefeller Center there, the headquarters of NBC. Monumental individual consumerism, which is going to push us towards the Great Depression on the tail end of this decade. But really, in reality, we're going to be chasing communists with the Palmer raids. There's going to be challenges to science and modernity with the Scopes monkey trial, the Tennessee teacher that is going to, John Scopes, want to teach evolution. William Jennings Bryant of earlier Cross of Gold speech fame in period 6 is going to be the prosecuting attorney that is going to deliver a rather fervent prosecution of this teacher. Very, very, I want to say televised, but it's very radioized. It's broadcast on radio. People are tuning in. It becomes quite the spectacle. And then the Lost Generation we see with Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway. These authors are going to capture the lost nature of this decade, this thinly veiled gildedness that is, that after World War I, we are in a state of disillusionment. And whether or not be the rampant drug use or the new music or the mass consumerism, this generation is lost. And these authors gathering in both New York and in Paris are going to highlight this decade as being one that's very void. The beatniks are going to do it in the 50s as well. So some comparison to both the beatniks of the 50s and the lost generation of the Roaring 20s. And foreign policy, well, we're going to have some international investment. You know, we do want to keep our economic ties with both Europe and with Asia, but we're going to see the implementation of peace treaties. In fact, in 21, we're going to engage in the Washington Naval Conference, which in essence tells the global powers to reduce their naval armament based on the size of their population. It has to be in proportion to the population, how much naval armament they could have. I'm sure Mahan is flipping around in his grave at this time, saying, you want to limit your Navy? What are you talking about? So it's almost like an arms reduction. The Kellogg-Brand Pact was signed during this time period that really said, hey, if other countries start to argue, let's not jump to war instantly. Remember the firing in Sarajevo? This alliance, this alliance, this alliance, this alliance. So the Kellogg-Brand Pact tried to prevent that. but in essence, it's going to prove to be ineffective once Germany invades Poland in 1939. So once again, returning that strong sense of American isolationism. And that isolationism, that inward look on us, is going to, in essence, bring us to our knees in the midst of what is going to be the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. A casual historian or a student might say, well, what caused the Great Depression? And instantly people will say, well, it was the stock market crash of 1929. And that's actually incorrect. The stock market crash of 1929 is almost an effect of all of the things that were happening for a larger decade. So for the better part of 8, maybe even 9 years before that stock market crash, we see individuals buying on credit in the 1920s, consumer goods. If you don't have enough money to buy this, well, advertisement will say, don't worry, give us $10 now and $5 a month to pay it off. Well, when the economy tanks, do you think they're going to pay that company back? No, they don't have the money to pay that back on credit. And in essence, that company is not going to get the revenue that they need for that product. And then they're going to have to pay their supplier. And that's just going to create a domino effect that's going to collapse the economy. Buying on margin is a significant challenge to the economic footprint. And that's a rather difficult concept to explain in such a short review. But in essence, people would buy the stock with a loan. So they would go to a broker or a lender, they would borrow a certain amount of money, invest it in the stock market, and if they got a return, well, the lender would get a portion of that profit from the stock market, as well as the individual that bought that. They would increase their return of revenue. But if the market crashed, not only would they have lost the money in the market, but they would have lost the money that they still owe to the lender. And then the lender would lose out on that money. So it only amplified that. So one of the first things Roosevelt said in his fireside chat and in his inaugural speech in 1933 is, we will stop buying stocks on margin, one of the chief initial causes of the Great Depression. The agricultural and the industrial sector being oversaturated in post-World War I is going to slow down significantly. The industrial sector is not producing wartime goods anymore. They're producing those personal goods. But the agricultural sector, think of those farmers out west. Let's throw a dust bowl on top of them in 33, one of the worst droughts in American history. And let's just now ramp up that economic production and that agricultural production, and it slows down. That war machine slows it down. And so they're going to find themselves at a great disadvantage in the days ahead. And lastly, the tariff rates. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act placed on by Herbert Hoover is just going to make things worse. His hope was that he would lock up the shores, slap a huge tariff on incoming goods, and that would help spur the manufacturing sector. But what do you think Europe and Asia did at the same time? They slapped tariffs on it as well, and that trade war only deepened us into the Great Depression. And that's going to cause the market crash of 29, rapid unemployment rate from the 20s and 30s, followed by, of course, bank failures of the 20s and 30s, those bank runs. And if you've been watching during the COVID-19 outbreak, some continuity and change even to 2020, you saw that the stock market would start to crash. There would be a safe measure in there, kind of a valve that would stop and seize the market so it couldn't fall anymore. So a lot of the tentacles of what occurred during the Great Depression are seen even in the COVID-19 outbreak to this very day. So in the simplest terms, the domestic program took aim. This is when the government's going to expand to its largest amount that we've seen, providing immediate economic relief and recovery from the effects of the Great Depression in industry, in agriculture, and in banking. And this is going to be the government injecting a significant amount of money into the economy to try to spur that. Another continuity and change, we see it again with that $2 trillion stimulus package that was just signed here in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't want to exhaustively read to you from this slide. So if you want to in the video, just pause it and you can take notes from here. This shows you just an overview of the relief and the recovery and the reform. I can't anticipate that the College Board is going to require you to memorize these items as much as they want you to see the processes, what was important about these various acts in helping to solidify immediate relief in the New Deal, what were some mid-range areas of recovery, and finally reform. In fact, I liken this to my students in class. If you cut your arm, the immediate relief is to bandage it up and put something on it. The recovery is the process for the next week or two to nurse that wound, to change out the gauze, to make sure it doesn't get infected. And the reform is doing things in your life that will prevent you from cutting your arm in the near future. So that three-stage approach should be a good way of looking at that. And again, pause the slide if you need to look at the various acts. Many of these specifically are going to be larger than other, particularly the relief programs, the retirement, and the Social Security Administration, which is still in place to this very day. Let's look at the 5 causes of World War I. There's that failure of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, isolationism in the midst of this, that global depression. It's not just a depression of the United States, but it's going to happen globally. In fact, Germany is already in a position where they're having to pay money back from that Treaty of Versailles. And so they're going to now be in even a larger global depression, placing not only Europe in a state of disillusionment, but the rest of the world in a state of disillusionment. But that's going to allow that vacuum of leadership to create new forms of leadership in the form of fascism with Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. So the 5 causes of World War II, again, Versailles, isolationism, a global depression in place, disillusionment, and that new form of leadership that's going to be appetizing to people who are, in essence, lost. And World War II mobilization, well, this is very similar to what we saw in World War I. The United States, once again, just 26 years later, getting ramped up to head off, ending the Great Depression. I don't want historians to mistaken that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. Please don't write that in your formal writing. That's inaccurate. The New Deal did help alleviate some of the pains of the Great Depression, but it's going to be the economic ramping up of mobilization during World War II that's really going to finally put a nail in the coffin of the Great Depression with that fervent industrialization. We're going to see rapid expansion in Seattle and Los Angeles. GDP growth, look at this. From 39 to 41, nominal GDP growth occurred at 8% a year, up to $99 billion in nominal GDP. But look at 41 to 44. 17% of GDP nominal growth each year for a total nominal GDP of $212 billion. The government expanded 600% during this time period of World War II. And there are those same social initiatives, home front initiatives like the war bonds and the metal drives, people asking, hey, don't throw away your spare tires or don't throw away your used tires. So they had large rubber collections and scrap metal collections during this time period. Industrial women like Rosie the Riveter created a campaign, the famed picture with the bandana on you see there on your screen, getting women to join the workforce en masse. But we do see some darker sides to this mobilization, racial segregation and civil liberties, particularly in the midst of the Double V campaign. Truman is going to address this more with his integration of the armed forces, with his executive order, but that's going to leave out, of course, one of FDR's largest mistakes, aside from his court packing scheme, and that is the regrettable internment of Japanese in these Japanese internment camps. So civil liberties are going to be a big question, particularly with the Korematsu versus the United States case. That was one of the worst Supreme Court decisions, along with Dred Scott. Political, though, the role of the presidency is going to be challenged in the midst of this. FDR passes away in the middle of World War II, in the middle of his 4th term, really getting the country to ask, is it a good idea to have 4 terms for a president? But you got to think about FDR. He was in a good position to bring the country out of an economic doldrum like the Great Depression. We were then instantly thrust into the Second World War. So why change up leadership at that time period? But the 22nd Amendment is going to come out shortly thereafter. That's going to limit the president in a codified law in a legal sense to only 2 terms. And then the expansion of the federal government, the likes the world had never seen. There's your military campaigns. We'll take just a few seconds and wrap up here. 16 million men served in uniform. That's about 11% of the U.S. population. They're going to serve in 2 campaigns, both in the Pacific and in the European theaters. In the Pacific theaters, and any of these campaigns, you could go back and look at why they are significant turning points. The Bataan Death March, a sad moment in American military history, in which the Japanese acquired the Philippine Islands and took the Filipinos and the Americans captive, marching them to a separate POW camp in which many died on that route. The Battle of Midway, the first pushback towards a Japanese aggressive military, Admiral Yamamoto being pushed back there at the Battle of Midway, now putting Japan in a position to fight a defensive war as opposed to an offensive war. Guadalcanal, they're close to Australia in this region, right down about in there, is going to preserve the shipping lanes near the Solomon Islands. That was a must-win for the United States and ended up becoming quite a long and brutal naval battle where ships were hundreds of yards apart firing armament into each other, much like an 18th century pirate ship battle. In Iwo Jima and Okinawa, again, the first time Americans arrived on Japanese soil, on mainland soil, not expanded territory, raising the famous flag at Suribachi, and then the regrettable bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a decision that Truman had to make to end the Second World War because there was already a victory over Europe just a few months prior to that. The North Africa campaign, with Rommel and Montgomery chasing each other in North Africa, Patton moving up through Italy, Eisenhower in the D-Day invasion taking continental Europe in a place called Normandy. The Germans were expecting them to arrive at Calais, the shortest distance between the British Isles and France, but they took Germany by surprise. But pushing and advancing through the brutal winter of Belgium, pushing back the German advance, 800,000 troops at the Battle of the Bulge, kind of Germany's last stand, and requiring Hitler to finally admit defeat, committing suicide, and ending the war in Europe. The Navy and Marines were the dominant military feature there in the Pacific, and the Army and then Air Corps was the dominant feature in the European theater, later to become the U.S. Air Force. Alrighty, my friends, so there it is, your tasks that are before you. Wow, that was a lot to get through. I'm proud of you for sticking with me on the Period 7 overview. The rest of them aren't going to be that intense because the content isn't that intense. But if you want to do some processing on your own, I encourage you to do so. You can complete that Unit 7 progress check. Only 39 multiple choice questions, so please make sure you can get into AP Classroom. Let me know if you can't, and I will gladly assist you in that endeavor. And also on Canvas, complete only one SAQ. You'll see it already loaded on Canvas. Get that completed and into me Sunday at 11:59. But as I've said time and time again, crystal clearly saying, if you can't get it done by then, the ultimate goal of you is to communicate with me. Talk to me, talk to me, talk to me, and I'll move those due dates around for you to make it so it's not a source of stress. I want learning history to be fun, not a source of stress for you. All right, thank you for hanging out with me on this very long discussion. If you made it through without pausing, hey, congratulations. But if you needed to stop throughout it, hey, I understand. I'm going to run off and take a break myself here as well. So keep studying, keep at it. Don't give up on me. Keep the hard work in that you're doing. I'm proud of you, and I miss you all and look forward to seeing you when we get ready for the Period 1 review coming up next. Take care.